So you can remain seated for the reading. You know our style in this community is that we take readings from many sources, from the Gnostic scriptures, from the canonical scriptures, from other faith traditions, from poetry, novels, and occasionally I'll read something I've written myself, and mainly it's poetry or a story form. But I wrote a piece this week which is a little bit technical because I want to talk about consciousness and science and psychology and spirituality in the homily. So this is the basis where I'll kind of tease it out in the course of the homily. I called it Bring On the Psychomysticists. If you want evidence for the contention that materialistic science, otherwise known as scientism, is deaf and blind, but definitely not mute, look at its strident claims that consciousness is simply an epiphenomenon of raw biochemical neuronal activity, or even worse, that consciousness doesn't exist at all. But there's not a single scientific formula nor a mathematical algorithm that isn't the fruit of human consciousness. Show me a poem, whether it be a Shakespearean sonnet or the rhyming couplets of a lovesick teenager, or show me a painting, whether it be a toddler's doodling or a masterpiece by Da Vinci, and I'll show you the product of consciousness at work. In fact, show me even an illusion, like the mistaken inference of snake from a piece of discarded rope, or even a delusion, the grandiose claim that you are Napoleon resurrected, and I will show you still further evidence of consciousness at play. In fact, the proclamations of the debunkers that consciousness does not exist is proof that their own consciousness is the very source of their being able to say that consciousness does not exist. It's like using language to claim that language does not exist, or that you arrived on the planet Earth without the mediation of a human mother. Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, put it very well when he said, "The meaning of life is this, that it has no meaning to say that life has no meaning." Words inspired by curiosity. I'm sure all of you are au fait with the game 20 questions. You play that? You know, so a bunch of us get together for a parlor game. There's maybe 8 or 9 of us. And we send one person out of the room. And then the rest of us pick a topic. It could be Mount Everest or, the Book of Kells or turnips. It could be anything. And the guy comes in and he's got 20 questions that have only yes or no answers. And he has to try to figure out, before the 20 questions are up, what it is that we've thought about. You all played that game? Well, there's a second version of this game. And it originated in the following fashion. One of the most famous American physicists of all time, a guy called John Archibald Wheeler, who lived to be 97 and just died a few years ago. He was playing this parlor game one time with a bunch of friends. And it was his turn to be the guy outside the door. So he goes outside the door, and the group inside decide to play a trick on him. They decide not to pick anything. But they're not going to tell him that. So he comes in, and he presumes they've chosen something, and he's got 20 questions to figure it out. So he starts asking questions, and he's noticing that they're taking longer and longer to come up with answers to the questions, because they haven't chosen anything, but they have to give answers, and their answers have to be consistent with each other. And by about question number 16, John Wheeler says, "Is it a cloud?" And the whole crowd break out laughing, because that was the only possibility left. Because of the way he'd structured his questions, he had backed them in to picking out the only possible word that fit all the answers to the previous questions was a cloud. And so he hadn't discovered a predetermined word. He'd forced them to choose a word because of the manner in which he'd asked the questions. Now, the funny thing was, if he'd asked different questions, he would have forced them into a different word. Or even if he'd asked the same questions in a different order, he'd have forced them to pick a different word. So what it says to me is this, in some sense, is that, is reality something we discover through our questions and experimentation and observations, or is reality something we create or co-create through our questions and observations and studies? That's what I talk about this morning a little bit. Because I believe that actually we're co-creators of reality. I do not believe that there's an external reality which we can discover through our observations or through our experimentation or through our questions. Rather, these help us to back nature in to creating a reality that's suited to our methodology. And I'm going to make the claim that the three great ways of doing this are through science, psychology, and spirituality. So that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to make 5 main points. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, firstly, and then I'm going to do a very brief history of science, then thirdly, a very brief history of spirituality, fourthly, a very brief synopsis of psychology, and then finally, I'm going to talk about the two three-legged stools. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So firstly, a few introductory remarks. From the time I was a teenager, I was fascinated by science, by psychology, and by spirituality. And I wanted somehow to be able to weave these three together like a Celtic knot. A Celtic knot has 3 strands to it. I wanted to try to weave these together into a meaningful thing. And so I spent 3 years at the National University of Ireland getting a Bachelor of Science degree in pure mathematics and mathematical physics, and then 8 years in a seminary studying spirituality and scripture and theology, and then 6 years doing a PhD in psychology. And now for the last 26 years, I've been trying to wed these 3 pieces together to try to make sense out of life. And so that's what I'm going to attempt to do this morning, very, very briefly. Obviously, in a half an hour, you can't give a brief history of science, or psychology, or spirituality, let alone put them all together and make sense of them. But I'm Irish, I'm going to give it a shot. So firstly, a brief history of science. And I'm going to start with Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton basically created what's known as the classical model of science or physics. And basically there are 5 components to his thinking. There's the notion of space. That space is the vast distances that exist between heavenly bodies. For instance, the sun is 93 million miles away from us. So space was very important in his calculations. And then the second one was the notion of time, particularly time being a linear progression from the past to the present to the future. And then the notion of causality, that A causes B, and if A causes B, A always has to happen before B happens. The cause always has to precede the consequence. And then the notion that there's an objective world or an objective cosmos out there, and the job of science is to ask the kinds of questions and make the kinds of leaps that allow us to understand what that objective reality is. And the 5th piece was, he was a very strong believer in God, that God was the originator of all this. So they'd be kind of the 5 elements of Newtonian thinking. A little bit later came René Descartes, this brilliant French polymath. And at this stage, the enlightenment is taking place in Europe, and they're beginning to see that the answers that religion is coming up with are insufficient. They won't look, for instance, through Galileo's telescope, and they'll crucify Copernicus for his belief system that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. So there's a bit of a divergence beginning to happen. And Descartes came up with the notion that henceforth, science would be in charge of examining the natural world or the natural cosmos, and religion would look at the supernatural. So now there's a split between the 2 of them. And over the years since then, religion went into a decline, whereas science took off and became really, really, really successful. Stage 3 then happens with the advent of, I'm going to call it scientism, materialistic science. A scientific model which is, it's based upon the Newtonian model of space and time and causation and an objective world. But where Newton figured God was a very, very important part of this equation, materialistic science doesn't believe in God. They threw God out of the equation. In fact, they claim that consciousness itself does not exist. It's merely an epiphenomenon of brain activity, and that we live in a meaningless universe. Now, they believe that there's an objective world out there, an objective cosmos, but it came about through absolutely random processes. There was no intelligence whatsoever behind it. And they very smugly suggest this, what they call the million monkeys test. That if you took 1 million monkeys and gave them each a typewriter and let them at it, eventually one of them, just through trial and error, would produce the entire collected works of Shakespeare. Just banging away on a computer. Now, I just finished reading a very interesting book on quantum mechanics a few days ago. And this guy went at pains to look at the asinine claim that monkeys typing on a typewriter, one of them would eventually create the collected works of Shakespeare. And he used the following example. I thought it was brilliant. He said, you take, for instance, the book Moby Dick. And the first line of Moby Dick is the statement, call me Ishmael. That's the first statement of the book. Call me Ishmael. Now, you imagine monkeys on a typewriter. Typically on a typewriter, there are 58 keys. So if a monkey just hammering away on a typewriter, the chance that he'll get the first letter correct, C for call, is one chance in 58 that he'll actually hit the correct key. The chance that he'll get an A immediately following that is 58 multiplied by 58. The chance that he'll get the first word right, C-A-L-L, is 58 multiplied by 58, multiplied by 58, multiplied by 58. Now, there are 13 words in that sentence, and there's a space bar, call, space bar, me, space bar, Ishmael. So he'd have to hit the right sequence 15 times. That means 58 by 58 by 58, 15 times. And can you guess what that number is? Johnny, come on, you're Ed's son. Very big. It's 283 trillion attempts. So a monkey would have to make 283 trillion attempts just to get that one sentence correct by chance. Now, if this was a very good monkey who was really good typing, and he could do 45 words a minute, and if he never slept or never took a potty break, how long would it actually take him to do it? 36 trillion years, which is 2,600 times the age of the universe itself. So if monkeys were at it for 2,600 universes, they wouldn't even get the first statement in the Moby Dick correctly, let alone produce the collected works of Shakespeare, let alone create this universe of ours with millions of galaxies, mountains, human beings, and rum racing ice cream. That could have all happened by chance. So what's the greatest act of faith you've ever been asked to make? Was it belief in the virgin birth, or the infallibility of the Pope, or the resurrection of Jesus, or life after death, or that God exists? It wasn't. I'll tell you what the biggest leap of faith you were ever asked to make. It's that there was a Big Bang that accounts for all of this. So this Big Bang, if you ask them, well, the Big Bang, when did it happen? And they said, that's a ridiculous question. You can't ask when did the Big Bang happen, because the Big Bang created time. There was no time before the Big Bang created. Okay, sorry. How about where did the Big Bang happen? And that's a dumb question. It was the Big Bang that created space. Space didn't exist before the Big Bang. That's a dumb question. Sorry. What was the energy of the Big Bang? That's a dumb question. The Big Bang created energy. There was no energy before the Big Bang created it. Okay? So, what caused the Big Bang? That's the dumb question. There was no causation before the Big Bang. The Big Bang created causation. And so, so we have a causeless cause. Doesn't that sound a little bit like Thomas Aquinas' proof for the existence of God? The uncaused cause. And we're meant to believe that a massless, energyless, spaceless, timeless event is responsible for all this. That's the biggest act of faith you were asked to make. The virgin birth and infallibility of the Pope are like minor little things in comparison with that. So that's where kind of scientism gets us. After that, in the progress, you come up now, for instance, with relativity theory and Einstein. And Einstein believed that space and time, in some senses, were very relative, or maybe, in a sense, an illusion. So he collapsed the two of them down to what he called space-time. But he believed in causality. But what he said was that if you were to travel at the speed of light, time would shrink to zero, there wouldn't be time, and distance would shrink to zero, there wouldn't be space. So at the speed of light, you don't have time, and you don't have space. Now, do you have causation? Very difficult to know. And so, but he did believe in an objective universe. He quipped one time when he was having an argument with a quantum physicist, he says, I choose to believe that the moon still exists when I'm not looking. So he believed there was an external objective universe out there. But he was a deeply mystical man. So he said at one stage, for instance, he said, religion without science is blind, but science without religion is lame. So that was Einstein. And then the final movement in science, I believe, was quantum mechanics in the beginning of the 1920s. Some great physicists like Max Planck, a German who really started it, and Niels Bohr, a Danish guy, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Wolfgang Pauli, John Archibald Wheeler, Richard Feynman. These were the great quantum physicists. And what they showed us was that the notion of space, we think of space as the vast distances between galaxies or star systems. And they showed that there's an inner space. So, for instance, your body has about 100 trillion cells. That's 10 to the power of 14 cells. And these cells are composed of molecules which are made up of atoms. And atoms are basically, there's about 10 to the power of 14 atoms in a single cell. So you have about 10 to the power of 28 atoms in your body. But each atom is 99.99999% empty space. So here's a fact. If you could extract all the empty space in all of the atoms of your body and harvest the matter, just the matter that's left over, when you take all the empty space, and you do that for every human being on the planet, all 7.6 billion of us, and you harvest all the matter from all the atoms in all our bodies, what would you be left with? A single grain of sand. That's how much matter all human beings actually hold in their systems when you take the empty space out of the atoms. In fact, if you were to take the planet itself, the entire planet Earth, and do the same thing for that, look at its atomic structure and take the empty space out of every atom on the planet, you'd be left with a marble this size. So there are some of the findings of quantum mechanics. And they're beginning to see, that there's an inner space which is extraordinary as well. And they're beginning to see that, causality isn't that A causes B, but it's much more like what Carl Jung defined as synchronicity, that A and B like to happen together. They're not causally connected, they are acausally connected. It's like one is the inner representation and the other is the outer representation, and they build upon each other. A little bit like when you're dreaming at night, it's your mind that's creating the dream. But then the dream is creating your mindset. So there's this loop that happens when you're dreaming. Your mind is creating the dream that you're experiencing as reality, and then that reality is impacting your mindset. That's the very same thing quantum mechanics are figuring out. That it is the experimentation and observation and questions that the physicists are asking that actually creating the reality, but the reality actually created the consciousness that is asking those questions. So again, it's this extraordinary loop. So that's a very a brief history of science. How about a brief history of spirituality? So way back, we start off as polytheists, and we invent basically three kinds of gods. We invent regional divinities, gods who are located in particular pieces of real estate. And if you move into their territory, you have to worship them. If you move out of their territory to someplace else, you've got to worship a different god. So that was the first kind of gods we invented. And then the second were tribal divinities who followed people around, like the Yahweh who followed the Israelites around, wherever they happened to be. And then the third kind of god was what I call portfolio gods. If you're interested in war making, here's the god you needed to worship. If you're interested in agriculture, here's the guy. If you're interested in art, here's the guy. So they had different portfolios. But they all had one thing in common, they were warring with each other. All these divinities were at war with each other. And they created followers who were also at war with each other. So at some stage we figured out, this is too complicated. Let's kind of boil it down a little bit. And the first person to actually preach monotheism was a pharaoh, an Egyptian pharaoh, about 1400 BCE, a guy called Akhenaten I. And he was so popular for doing this that they assassinated him. And so it wasn't tried again until Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism boiled it all down to two gods, a god of light and a god of dark, Uhura Mazda and Ahriman. And then when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon, they came under the influence of Zoroastrianism, and they took this idea and they consented even further to a single god. Then this monotheistic god became the kind of the template. But this monotheistic God was a distant, demanding deity who just issued edicts and laws and then punished people for the infringement and created heaven and hell. And moreover, this one God, whom Islam and Judaism and Christianity worship, has been the reason why particularly Islam and Christianity have massacred each other and then, as a bonus, massacred the Jews as well. So in the worship of this one God, we've massacred each other literally by the millions. So then the third stage of spirituality is the notion of fundamentalist religion. And at this stage now, we have kind of shrunken down the worship of God to a kind of love becomes fear, and the quest for truth becomes dogma, and a belief system becomes a reason for inquisition and for crusades. And in some parts of the world, that's still what's happening. And then the fourth movement, which was there all along underneath, is spiritual, mystical spirituality. And there are basically three kinds of mysticism. The first one is called nature mysticism. The second one is called deity mysticism. And the third one is called non-dual mysticism. So nature mysticism is people, who find God through nature. They have transcendent experiences through being out in nature. Deity mysticism is where you worship a particular, version of God and you fall in love with this completely. And non-dual mysticism is the realization that there is only God, that everything else really is just an epiphenomenon, an articulation, a manifestation of it. And so, for instance, Sufism will say only God exists. The way I've put this in the past, I've said that life is simply a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having. So basically, everything that exists is simply God in drag. That's the story of non-dual mysticism. Basically, everything is just God in drag. And the fourth point, the brief history of psychology. Up to the 1880s, psychology was literally just a part of philosophy. So epistemology was the part of philosophy that studied, how we know what we know. And ontology was the part of philosophy that told us how we understand what's real. And psychology was the part of philosophy that taught you how the mind worked. So literally, it was that aspect of psychology, of philosophy, that's examining its own mental processes. But in the 1880s, it became a kind of an empirical experimental science. A man in Germany called Wilhelm Wundt invented, experimental psychology, and it began to diverge from philosophy thereon. So that was the first beginnings, about 1880. Then in the early 1900s, you had Sigmund Freud, who went back again to a kind of theoretical kinds of psychology, where you're trying to figure out the meaning of mind, and particularly using dreams in order to understand how the mind operates, and figuring out that there were three levels to it. There was the unconscious, the subconscious, and consciousness, and the interplay of these things, have revealed what the mind was. In the 1920s, there was a reaction to this psychoanalysis, and it's called behaviorism. And there was two versions of it. One version in Russia, Pavlov and his salivating dogs, and one version in America called Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and his behaviorism. And their belief system was that there's a black box we carry between our ears. We're not conscious beings. We simply have a brain. We have no idea how it operates. Consciousness does not exist. But we're born tabula rasa. We're born like an empty blackboard, and you can write anything on it you want. So by rewarding or punishing particular behavior, you can create any kind of child you want, or you can kind of manipulate society to become any way you want it to be. So that was kind of behaviorism, which is still very strong in American academia, even today. In the 1940s, Carl Gustav Jung came into his own. He'd been a confrere of Freud's way back at the beginning, but he comes into his own in the 1940s particularly. And Jung was, I think, probably the greatest psychologist of all time, personally. And he had a very strong relationship with a guy called Wolfgang Pauli, who was an Italian physicist who won a Nobel Prize for physics. They had this ongoing exchange, went on for years and years and years, because Jung was fascinated by quantum mechanics, and Pauli was fascinated by Jungian psychology, and they traded experiences. And Jung wrote very famously at one stage, he says, atoms and archetypes have this in common. They cannot be directly observed, they can only be inferred from their effects. And that's true of quantum mechanics. You can't observe an atom. You can only infer the existence of atoms from the effects they have around them. And it's true in psychology. You can't directly observe an archetype. What's an archetype? An archetype is like the building block of the psyche. In the same way that DNA is the building block of matter, or atoms are the building blocks of matter, and DNA are the building blocks of an organism. In the very same way, archetypes are the building block of the psyche. And Jung made the comment that atoms and archetypes are very similar. So one of them is the intrapsychic aspect, and the other is the external physicalized aspect of the same reality. A reality that can only be inferred from its effects, but never observed directly by itself. So an extraordinary genius, fascinated by quantum mechanics. Then in the 1950s, you had the arrival of humanistic psychology. People like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, and you had the notion of the human potential movement and the notion of peak experiences gained traction in the 1950s as a reaction to behaviorism. And then in the 1960s, you had the arrival of transpersonal psychology. And this was a very holistic model that looked at the human being as mind, body, spirit, relationships, and creativity. And so you had to factor all these things in order to understand human beings. So that was basically a very quick look then at the evolution of psychology. Now the fifth point I want to make then is this. What do we do with all these pieces? Because I'm convinced that as we forge reality in the future, it'll be predicated on these three great sciences. Science, quantum mechanics, psychology, and spirituality. So the last point I make is this. I'm going to call it the two three-legged stools. So as we forge forward and we're trying to co-create reality, which version of these three disciplines are we going to use? The worst possible version to use would be scientism, materialistic science, allied to behavioral psychology and fundamentalist religion. That's the worst combination possible to forge the future. Because what scientism is going to give you is meaninglessness. And what behavioral psychology is going to give you is the ability to manipulate people who live in a meaningless world. And what fundamentalist religion is going to give you is fear now and fear of the afterlife. Are we going to go to heaven or hell? So that combination of materialistic science, behavioral psychology, and fundamentalist religion would be a total disaster trying to build our future. But there's a lot of people trying to build a future using those three. What is the ideal way to build a future? It is to wed quantum mechanics with transpersonal psychology and mystical spirituality. And then what do you have? You have quantum mechanics, which is looking again at the mystery and the awe and the interplay between how we're co-creating with whatever is out there. You've got transpersonal psychology, which allows us to access transcendental experiences. And you've got mystical spirituality, which teaches us that ultimately this is God's game. As Hinduism will say, this is Laila. This is the game of God. And that is the way we're going to build a future if we're going to survive as a species and evolve as a species. So ultimately, there are four considerations, I believe. If, in fact, we're not discovering an existing objective reality that pre-exists, but rather co-creating the reality, then the considerations are the following. We have to look at what are the questions I'm asking myself. Because it's the questions that the physicists are asking that are creating the results they're getting. The second one would be, what are the experiments I am doing in life? Now, you don't have to have a white coat to do an experiment. You can do an experiment in your own mind. What are the experiments I'm carrying out? Thirdly, what are the observations that I'm making? Where is my attention going? And then finally, which stool are you sitting on?